The egg cracked slower than the others. On the stone platform of Skarn Prime, under a sky the color of dried blood, 7 eggs sat in a circle of fire-lit sand. 6 of them had already broken open with loud snaps, and 6 young dragons had already stumbled out, screaming their first breath of flame into the air. The crowd of elder dragons cheered each time, but the 7th egg just sat there, shaking a little, making no sound at all. Dara Voss almost didn't check the noise at all. 5 years is a long time to keep a secret, but Dara Voss had done it, one careful day at a time. The bunker under her workshop had changed a lot since the night she first carried in a shaking, half-frozen hatchling wrapped in her jacket. Now it held a training space, a feeding area, and a wall covered in scratch marks where Rook liked to sharpen his claws on old scrap metal. Rook himself had changed too. He was bigger now, closer to the size of a large dog than the tiny bundle he'd once been, though still far smaller than any full-grown dragon had a right to be at his age. His pale gray scales had darkened slightly, and his crooked wings had grown stronger, even if they still sat uneven on his back. He still couldn't breathe fire, not one spark, not even after years of trying. "Try again," Dara said one evening, standing a safe distance away with her arms crossed. "Deep breath. Push it out from your chest, not your throat." Rook took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and pushed. Nothing came out but a small huff of warm air. "Nothing," he said, his voice low and a little rough, the voice of someone who had practiced speech mostly through quiet nights with one patient teacher. "It's never going to work, Dara." "Maybe not," she said honestly, because she had never been the type to lie just to make someone feel better. "But maybe fire isn't your thing. Doesn't mean you don't have a thing." She had raised him this way from the start, not with dragon traditions she knew nothing about, but with the only thing she really understood, engineering. She taught him the way she had been taught, through problem-solving, patience, and repeating a task until it worked, or until you learned exactly why it didn't. She taught him to read using old technical manuals lying around the workshop, to fix small tools with his claws once they grew steady enough, and to think through problems step by step instead of giving up the moment something felt impossible. Rook grew up believing, deep down, that he was broken. It was hard not to, when the first thing he could ever remember about his own kind was being called a mistake. Dara fought against that belief every chance she got, correcting him firmly whenever he called himself weak or useless. "Weak and worthless aren't the same word," she told him more than once. "You're weak at breathing fire, that's it. That's the whole list." It was around this time that Lena found them. Lena worked as a colony mechanic, young, quick with tools, and even quicker with her mouth. She had noticed Dara sneaking extra ration packs for weeks, and finally decided to follow her one evening out of pure nosiness. She found the entrance to the hidden bunker, slipped inside quietly, and nearly screamed when she came face to face with a dragon crouched in the shadows. Rook froze, Dara froze. For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. "Okay," Lena finally said, staring wide-eyed at the two of them. "Okay, this is definitely not what I thought was going on." Dara braced herself for the worst, ready to explain, to beg if she had to. Instead, Lena slowly lowered herself onto an overturned crate, still staring at Rook like she couldn't quite believe her own eyes. "He's just sitting there," Lena said. "I thought dragons were supposed to be terrifying." "He's harmless," Dara said carefully. "He can't even breathe fire." Lena looked between them, and something in her sharp mind clicked into place. Whatever this was, it clearly mattered a great deal to Dara, and Dara wasn't someone who cared about things carelessly. "If I tell anyone," Lena said slowly, "the Dominion finds him, right, and that's bad." "Very bad," Dara said. Lena let out a long breath, then shrugged. "Guess I didn't see anything then." From that day on, Lena became part of the small, careful circle protecting Rook's existence, bringing spare parts for him to tinker with and, more importantly, another set of hands to help watch for trouble. It was Lena, in fact, who first noticed something strange about Rook's abilities. One afternoon, while helping him lift a heavy piece of scrap metal, Rook stumbled and dropped it directly onto his own foot. Both of them braced for a cry of pain. Instead, the impact seemed to simply vanish, the metal bouncing away as if it had struck solid stone instead of flesh and bone. "Did that just not hurt you?" Lena asked, staring. Rook flexed his foot, confused. "It didn't." They tested it carefully over the following weeks. Rook couldn't create fire, but he could absorb impact, force, and heat, pulling that energy into himself and redirecting it outward in short, controlled bursts. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't the kind of raw power that made dragons fearsome in old stories. But it was real, and it was entirely his own, something no full-blooded dragon back on Scarn Prime had ever needed to develop, because none of them had ever needed to survive without fire in the first place. "See," Dara said, unable to keep a small, proud smile off her face. "Not broken, different." Rook didn't fully believe her yet. Old fears took a long time to burn away, especially when there had never been any fire to burn them with in the first place. But something in her words settled a little deeper into him that day, a small seed of belief that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the mistake Torvin had once called him. That fragile piece was tested only weeks later, when a Dominion inspection drone made an unscheduled sweep over the colony, its scanning lights sweeping low over rooftops and yards. Dara, Lena, and Rook scrambled in a panic, shutting down every heat source in the bunker, sealing the entrance with old crates, and staying frozen in silence for nearly 20 long minutes as the drone's mechanical hum passed directly overhead. When it finally moved on, none of them spoke for a long moment, hearts still pounding. "That was too close," Lena whispered. Dara nodded slowly, looking over at Rook, who sat pressed low against the ground, wings tucked tight, eyes wide with a fear that went far deeper than any drone. She didn't say anything else that night. She didn't need to. All three of them understood without a single word that the secret they were protecting was growing bigger and far more dangerous to hide with every year that passed. Holt had suspected for a long time that Dara Voss was hiding something. He just hadn't expected it to be quite this big. As colony overseer, it was his job to know what happened on Reth's Hollow, from mining quotas to supply shortages to the small daily dramas of colony life. Dara's strange behavior over the past few years, extra rations quietly disappearing, sudden reasons to avoid overtime shifts, a locked storage bunker she never let anyone near, had all quietly added up in the back of his mind. He wasn't a fool, and he wasn't blind. He simply chose to wait, because in his experience, people usually revealed their secrets on their own timeline, and pushing too early only made them dig in harder. The near miss with the inspection drone finally pushed him to act. He found Dara alone in her workshop late one evening, arms crossed, waiting for him with the tired look of someone who already knew this conversation was coming. "You're going to ask about the bunker," she said before he could speak. "I am," Holt admitted. She hesitated only a moment before deciding honesty was the only real option left. She told him everything, the crash, the hatchling, the years of secrecy, all of it. She braced herself for anger, for orders to report it immediately, maybe even for her own removal from the colony. Instead, Holt sat down heavily on a nearby crate and rubbed his face with both hands. "You know," he said slowly, "this isn't the first secret I've kept from the Dominion." Dara blinked in surprise. Holt explained in a low, careful voice that colony administrators sometimes had to make quiet choices the Dominion never saw, small acts of protection for the humans under their care. Things like underreporting mining injuries so families wouldn't be reassigned to harder labor, or shifting supply numbers to make sure sick workers still got proper food. None of it broke Dominion law outright, but all of it bent the spirit of a system that saw human colonists as replaceable labor rather than people. "I don't like keeping secrets," Holt said, but I like the Dominion treating us like tools even less. By the end of the conversation, Holt hadn't just agreed to stay silent, he had agreed to help. That help became necessary faster than any of them expected. Dominion demands on Reth's Hollow's mining output had been increasing steadily for months, pushing colony workers into longer shifts and more dangerous tunnels to meet impossible quotas. Then came the announcement that made everyone's stomach drop. Commander Torvin himself was coming to personally oversee the colony's next production cycle. Dara felt the name hit her like a physical blow the moment she heard it over the colony broadcast. She had heard Rook speak Torvin's name only once, years ago, in a quiet, pained voice while describing fragmented memories from his earliest days. The dragon who called him a mistake. The dragon who sealed him into an exile pod without a shred of mercy. Now that same dragon was coming to their planet. "You need to stay hidden," Dara told Rook that night, her voice tighter than usual. "Completely hidden, no mistakes." Rook, now nearly full-grown though still noticeably smaller than any standard dragon, nodded slowly, his earlier confidence dimming under a wave of old fear. Torvin's arrival brought a heavy, tense energy over the colony. His presence was enormous, both physically and in the way every human worker seemed to shrink slightly whenever he passed. His dark red scales and cold eyes, a constant reminder of exactly how small humans were in the eyes of the Dominion. He pushed mining quotas even higher, demanding faster extraction with little regard for safety, treating the colonists as nothing more than tools meant to serve a purpose and be discarded when worn out. The tension exploded during a routine shift nearly a week into Torvin's visit, when an overworked support beam in one of the deeper mining tunnels finally gave way. Rock and debris came crashing down, trapping 3 colony workers beneath collapsing stone, their emergency signals crackling out desperate calls for help. Rescue teams rushed in immediately, but the tunnel kept shifting dangerously, threatening a second, larger collapse that could kill everyone inside, rescuers included. Dara arrived at the scene just as Holt was ordering an emergency retreat, unwilling to risk more lives on an unstable structure. But retreating meant leaving 3 people to die. Rook had followed Dara at a distance, hidden in the shadows near the tunnel entrance, watching the chaos unfold with growing horror. He knew what he could do. He also knew what discovery would mean. For one long, agonizing moment, he hesitated. Then he thought of Dara's voice, patient and certain, telling him again and again that weak and worthless were never the same word. He thought of every quiet lesson about choosing to act instead of hiding from fear. He moved, slipping into the tunnel through a side passage before anyone could stop him. Rook pressed himself against the failing support structure, absorbing the shifting, crushing force of collapsing rock into his own body, the way he had practiced for years in secret. It hurt, more than anything he'd felt before, but he held steady, redirecting that dangerous energy safely into the tunnel floor instead of letting it crush the trapped workers. The rescue team pulled all 3 survivors free in the following minutes, shaken and injured but alive. Nobody saw Rook slip back into the shadows afterward, almost nobody. High above the mining site, one of Torvin's personal scanning drones registered a brief, unexplainable energy spike, unlike anything in its recorded database, originating from directly inside the collapsing tunnel. That night in his temporary command post overlooking the colony, Torvin stared at the anomalous reading on his display screen, his expression darkening with cold, calculating interest. "Lock down the colony," he ordered his officers. "Something here does not belong." The lockdown began before sunrise. Dominion patrol drones swept low over every street and building in Reth's Hollow, their scanning lights cutting sharp lines through the early morning dust. Colony workers were ordered to remain in their homes, while search teams moved methodically from building to building, searching for whatever had caused the strange energy reading in the mining tunnel. Nobody in the colony needed to be told this was serious. Torvin's personal guards did not conduct routine searches. This was a hunt. Inside the hidden bunker, Dara paced back and forth while Lena kept watch near the entrance and Holt sat grimly by the comm terminal, monitoring the search team's movements across the colony. Rook lay curled in the corner, his earlier injuries from absorbing the tunnel collapse still aching beneath his scales, though he'd insisted more than once that he was fine. "They're getting closer," Holt said quietly, watching the search pattern on his screen. "2 more buildings, maybe 3, and they'll reach this block." "We move him," Dara said immediately. "There has to be somewhere else, some other tunnel anywhere." "Dara," Rook's voice was steadier than she expected. She turned to find him already standing, favoring one side slightly from his injuries, but with a calm certainty in his eyes she had never seen from him before. "There isn't anywhere else. You know that." "There's always somewhere else," she said, her voice cracking slightly with a fear she rarely allowed herself to show. "Not this time." Rook took a slow step toward her. "If they search every building and eventually find me hiding in a hole somewhere, they punish everyone who hid me. You, Lena, Holt, maybe the whole colony. But if I walk out there myself on my own, maybe that's different." "That's not different, that's worse." Lena snapped from her position by the door. "You walk out there, they'll kill you." "Maybe," Rook admitted. "But I won't let anyone else pay for something I chose to let you hide. That's not who you raised me to be." Dara opened her mouth to argue further, then stopped, because she recognized something in his voice she had spent years trying to build, on purpose, choice by choice, lesson by lesson. Confidence. Not the reckless confidence of raw dragon strength, but the quiet, deliberate confidence of someone who understood exactly what he stood for. She hated it. She was also, despite everything, proud of it. "If you're doing this," she said finally, "you're not doing it alone." Rook stepped out of the hidden bunker and into the colony square just as a Dominion search team rounded the corner, their scanning equipment immediately locking onto him with a sharp, high-pitched alert tone. Within minutes, word reached Torvin directly, and the commander himself arrived at the square, his massive form casting a long shadow over the gathered crowd of colonists and soldiers. Torvin studied the smaller dragon standing before him with narrowed eyes, and recognition slowly crept across his face. "The runt," Torvin said, something between disbelief and disgust in his voice. "I remember sealing that pod myself. I expected you to be dead within a season." "I nearly was," Rook said calmly. "Humans found me instead." Murmurs spread through the watching soldiers. Torvin's eyes narrowed further, sweeping over Rook's still small frame with obvious contempt. "You're still weak," Torvin said. "Still small, still no fire, raised by lesser creatures who don't even understand what strength means. I should have known even exile couldn't fix what was broken in you from birth." "I'm not broken," Rook said, and though his voice stayed level, something firm settled underneath the words. "I'm just different from what you expected." Torvin's patience, thin from the start, snapped entirely. By Dominion law, exiled hatchlings who resurface are to be immediately destroyed, an example against any who think exile is escapable. He turned to his soldiers. "Take him, and burn this pathetic colony's storage buildings as a reminder of what happens to those who shelter Dominion property." Before any soldier could move, Dara stepped out of the crowd and placed herself directly between Rook and Torvin's forces. A heartbeat later, Lena stood beside her. Then Holt. Then, slowly, hesitantly, other colony workers began stepping forward too, forming a loose but determined line between the Dominion soldiers and the dragon they had spent years protecting. Torvin stared at the gathering humans with open astonishment, as if the very idea of such defiance had never occurred to him. "You would risk your lives," he said slowly, "for a runt with no fire." "He's not a runt," Dara said, her voice shaking slightly but refusing to break. "He's family." "He saved 3 of our people," Holt added. "Nearly died doing it. That's more than your Dominion's ever done for us." Torvin's expression twisted into something cold and furious. Whatever small chance there had been for a peaceful resolution vanished entirely in that moment, replaced by the commander's absolute conviction that this insult, this open defiance from creatures the Dominion considered barely worth noticing, could not be allowed to stand. "Then you can burn beside him," Torvin said, and raised a clawed hand toward his soldiers. "Attack!" The soldiers surged forward, fire building visibly in their throats, ready to make an example that would be remembered across every mining colony under Dominion control. Colonists scattered and screamed, diving for cover as the first blasts of flame roared toward the square. Rook moved without thinking, throwing himself forward, wings spread wide, placing his own body between the incoming fire and the humans who had sheltered him for over 5 years. Fire rolled across the colony square in a wave of heat and light, and for one terrible second, it looked like nothing could stop it. Then it hit Rook, and instead of burning through him, the flame simply stopped. His scales glowed faintly along the edges as he pulled the fire's force into himself, the same way he had pulled the crushing weight of collapsing stone into his body back in the mining tunnel. It hurt, sharp and burning, but he had spent 5 years learning to hold steady against pain instead of running from it. He planted his feet, spread his wings wider, and did not fall. Torvin's soldiers stared in confusion as their attack simply vanished into the small gray dragon standing his ground before them. Fire that should have leveled buildings and scattered humans instead disappeared into Rook's body, without leaving a single scorch mark on the colonists sheltering behind him. "Impossible," one soldier muttered. Rook straightened, breathing hard, energy crackling faintly along his scales. "I told you," he said, looking directly at Torvin. "Different, not broken." Before Torvin could respond, Rook released the absorbed energy in a controlled burst, not aimed to kill, but aimed precisely at the ground beneath the charging soldiers' feet. The force sent them stumbling backward, weapons and flames scattering harmlessly into the dirt instead of toward the colonists. That was when the humans moved. Holt shouted orders, directing colony workers toward mining equipment stationed nearby for the day's shift, heavy drills and loader machines built for breaking solid rock. Lena scrambled into the nearest loader, gunning its engine and driving it directly into the path of a second wave of soldiers, using the machine's reinforced shielding to block their advance. Other workers grabbed emergency flares, tools, anything heavy or bright enough to create confusion, throwing the disciplined Dominion attack into chaos it had never been trained to handle. It wasn't dragon combat. It wasn't fire against fire, strength against strength. It was human ingenuity, resourceful and unpredictable, paired with a dragon who had been raised to think his way through problems instead of simply overpowering them. Together, it worked in a way pure Dominion tradition never could have anticipated. Torvin watched his forces stumble into disarray with rising fury, then turned his full attention on Rook, deciding to end this personally. He lunged forward, jaws open, flame building deep in his throat for a final, overwhelming blast meant to finish what he'd started at the hatching ceremony years ago. Rook didn't retreat. He stepped forward to meet him. As Torvin's flame roared out, Rook absorbed it fully, every bit of heat and force pulled into his small frame until his scales glowed bright along every crooked line of his uneven wings. For one breathless moment, he held all of it inside himself, more energy than he had ever handled before, pain and power tangled together until he could barely stand. Then he let it go, all at once, redirecting the full force of Torvin's own fire straight back at him. The blast struck true, knocking the massive commander clean off his feet and slamming him hard into the dirt of the square. Torvin lay stunned for a long moment, scales scorched, pride shattered far worse than his body, staring up in disbelief at the small gray dragon standing over him. Rook could have finished it there. Every soldier watching expected him to. Instead, he simply stood, breathing hard, and did not strike again. "You said I wasn't a dragon," Rook said quietly, loud enough for every soldier in the square to hear. "You said weak things don't deserve names. You were wrong about both." Torvin said nothing, too stunned, too humiliated to find any words at all. Rook turned his back on him deliberately, walking instead toward Dara, Lena, and Holt, standing tall despite the exhaustion and pain clearly written across his body. The remaining soldiers, seeing their commander defeated and their assault broken apart by a combination of human machinery and a dragon they'd been taught did not deserve to exist, slowly lowered their weapons, unsure of what came next without orders they trusted. Word of what happened on Reth's Hollow spread far faster than the Dominion could contain it. A commander, defeated not by another dragon's strength, but by an exiled runt raised among humans, using abilities no pure-blooded dragon had ever needed to develop. Whispers of it reached other colonies, other outcasts, other dragons who had spent their whole lives being told that birth alone decided worth. Small cracks of doubt began forming in a belief system that had stood unquestioned for generations. Unwilling to risk further embarrassment or unrest, the Dominion quietly withdrew its harshest demands from Reth's Hollow within the following months, granting the colony greater independence and ending the punishing extraction quotas that had strained it for years. It wasn't a grand political victory announced with fanfare. It was a quiet retreat, the kind that happens when those in power realize continuing a fight only makes their weakness more visible. Rook never went back to Scarn Prime. He didn't need to. Everything that mattered to him was already here. Months later, on a clear evening with the colony's lights glowing steadily below, Rook stood beside Dara on a rocky ridge overlooking Reth's Hollow, no longer hidden, no longer afraid. His wings, still crooked, still uneven, stretched wide against the darkening sky as workers below occasionally waved up at him, familiar now instead of frightened. "You did good," Dara said simply, watching the sunset beside him. Rook glanced down at her, the same engineer who had once wrapped a shaking, broken hatchling in her jacket and refused to let him go. "We did," he corrected gently. He had been called a mistake once, a stain on his bloodline, nameless and unworthy of memory. Standing there now, strong in ways no dragon tradition could measure, he understood at last what Dara had spent 5 patient years trying to teach him. He had never been the weakest dragon. He had simply been raised by the right hands. It was late, and her back hurt from 12 hours of fixing broken drill parts, and the last thing she wanted was to walk across the supply yard because something had knocked over a few crates. Probably a wind gust. Probably one of the old storage shelves finally giving out after years of rust. That was the kind of thing that happened on Reth's Hollow. Nothing exciting ever landed on this planet. Nothing exciting ever happened here at all. But the sound she heard was not the sound of metal falling. It was smaller than that, softer, almost like crying. She grabbed a flashlight and walked out into the yard, stepping over scattered crates and a knocked-down fence panel. The air smelled like burnt metal, sharp and strange, nothing like the usual dust and oil smell of the colony. She followed the smell to a strange object half buried near the fence, a smooth metal pod, cracked open on one side, still faintly smoking. Dara had never seen anything like it. It clearly wasn't colony equipment. It wasn't anything from any supply ship either. For one panicked second, she thought about calling Colony Command right away. Reth's Hollow had a treaty with the Dragon Dominion, and part of that treaty said humans had to report anything unusual, especially anything that came from the sky. That was the rule. Report first, ask questions later. She took one step back toward the comm terminal on the wall. Then she heard the sound again, closer now, weaker. A small, shaking whimper coming from inside the pod. Curiosity beat caution. She always told herself that was her biggest flaw, and maybe it was, but she stepped closer instead of walking away. Inside the cracked pod was a small creature, pale gray, curled into a tight ball, shivering hard enough that its whole thin body shook. Its wings were bent underneath it at an odd angle, and one of its front legs looked scraped raw from the crash. It looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes, and Dara realized, with a jolt of surprise, exactly what she was looking at. A dragon, a baby dragon, small enough to fit in her arms. She had seen dragons before, only from a distance, huge and terrifying, flying over the colony during Dominion inspections. They were the reason humans on this planet worked so hard and complained so little. Nobody wanted to upset the Dominion, but this dragon was nothing like the one she had seen in the sky. This one looked broken, abandoned, alone. "Hey," she said quietly, crouching down slowly so she wouldn't scare it. "Hey, it's okay." The little dragon flinched at her voice but didn't try to run. It couldn't have run even if it wanted to. It was too weak, too hurt, too small. Dara thought about the treaty again. Report first, ask questions later. If she called this in, Dominion officers would come, and dragons did not treat their own weak or wounded kindly, not from what little she knew of their culture. She had heard stories, rumors really, about dragons who were cast out for being too small or too slow or unable to breathe fire. If this hatchling had been thrown away by his own kind, sending him back to the Dominion wasn't rescue. It was a death sentence. She made her decision faster than she expected to. "All right," she muttered, mostly to herself. "All right, come here." She wrapped him carefully in her jacket, feeling how light he was, lighter than a sack of tools, and carried him quietly back to her workshop instead of the main colony building. Her shop had a storage bunker underneath it, an old maintenance space nobody used anymore since the main drill systems had been upgraded. It was dry, hidden, and far from prying eyes. It would do for now. She laid him down on a folded blanket and sat back, looking at the strange, trembling creature she had just decided to hide from an entire empire. "You need a name," she said, half to break the silence, half because it felt wrong to keep calling him it or the dragon. Her eyes landed on a bent, gray engine part sitting on her workbench, a piece she'd nicknamed Rook years ago because of its crooked, chess-piece shape. The little dragon's wing bent in almost the exact same way. "Rook," she said. "I'll call you Rook." He didn't understand the word yet, of course, but he stopped shivering slightly at the sound of her voice, which felt like enough for now. Over the next few days, Dara learned quickly that raising a dragon was nothing like she imagined. She had no idea what dragons ate, so she tried everything from ration paste to scraps of machine coolant, watching carefully to see what he would actually swallow. She learned he liked warmth, curling up against the workshop's old heating pipes whenever he could. She learned he was afraid of loud engine noises, flinching hard the first time a drill fired up nearby. She also learned, slowly and with growing worry, that Rook could not do any of the things a dragon was supposed to do. No fire, no smoke, not even a spark. His wings, when they eventually straightened out enough to move, were too weak to lift him more than a few inches off the ground. Colony Overseer Holt noticed her sudden secrecy almost immediately, the way she avoided long conversations and rushed back to her workshop the moment her shift ended. He didn't say anything yet, only watched her with a raised eyebrow whenever their paths crossed, filing the strange behavior away for later. Late one night, sitting on the floor of the bunker while Rook slept curled against her boots for warmth, Dara looked down at the small, broken creature the Dominion had thrown away like garbage. "They gave up on you," she said quietly. "I'm not going to." She didn't know yet what that promise would cost her. She only knew she meant it. Commander Torvin stood at the front of the crowd with his arms crossed. He was a huge dragon, dark red like burnt iron, with scars across his chest from 100 wars. He did not cheer. He watched the seventh egg the way a hunter watches a wounded animal. "That one is late," he said. "Late eggs are weak eggs." Nobody argued with him. Nobody ever did. When the shell finally broke, it did not shatter. It just fell apart in small pieces, and out came a hatchling that made the whole crowd go quiet. He was small, smaller than a dragon should ever be. His scales were pale gray instead of a strong color like red or black or gold. His wings were thin and did not sit right on his back, one higher than the other. He opened his mouth to breathe fire like his brothers and sisters had done, and nothing came out, not even smoke. A few dragons laughed. Torvin did not laugh. His face went hard and cold. "This is not a dragon," he said. "This is a mistake." The hatchling's mother stood near the edge of the platform. She was a proud gold dragon, and every one of her other children had been strong. She looked at the small gray hatchling shivering on the stone, and for 1 second something in her eyes softened. But Dragon Law was older than any mother's feelings, and she did not move to help him. She only looked away. Torvin walked forward and picked up the hatchling by the back of his neck, the way one might pick up a broken tool meant for the scrap pile. The little dragon did not fight. He was too weak and too confused and too small to understand what was happening to him. "By the law of the Dominion," Torvin announced to the crowd, "any hatchling that cannot breathe fire is not fit to carry the name of dragon. He will be sent to exile, to a world so poor and so forgotten that even the Dominion does not bother to watch it. If he survives, that is between him and the stars. If he does not, that is no loss to us." The crowd murmured in agreement. It was tradition. It was the way things had always been done. Weakness was not tolerated among dragons, because dragons believed that strength was the only thing that kept their empire alive. An exile pod was brought forward, a small metal capsule barely large enough to hold the shivering hatchling. Torvin placed him inside himself, his claws rough against the small dragon's gray scales. "You have no name," Torvin said, staring down at him. "Nameless things do not deserve to be remembered." The hatchling looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes, too young to understand the words but old enough to feel the coldness behind them. Then the pod hissed shut, sealing him inside in total darkness. The launch was quick and rough. The pod was fired from Skarn Prime like garbage being thrown away, sent tumbling through the black of space with no course chosen and no one watching where it landed. Inside, the small dragon curled into a tight ball, shaking, alone, with no fire to warm him and no mother to protect him. Days passed, maybe longer. The pod drifted through the emptiness of space, bouncing off nothing, guided only by chance. Eventually, it was pulled toward the gravity of a small, rocky planet on the far edge of Dominion space, a place called Reth's Hollow. It was a mining world, mostly forgotten, home to human workers who dug metal out of the ground for a living and rarely saw anything interesting in their gray, dusty sky. The pod entered the atmosphere burning hot, shaking violently, alarms blaring inside even though there was no one to hear them. It crashed down hard into the edge of a supply yard, kicking up dust and knocking over stacked crates, before finally rolling to a stop against a metal fence. For a long moment, nothing happened. The yard was silent except for the ticking sound of hot metal cooling in the evening air. Then from the wreckage came a small, frightened sound. Not a roar, not a growl, just a soft, broken whimper, the sound of something very young and very alone, waking up in a world it did not understand, with no one left to tell it what it was supposed to be. The hatch cracked open on its own, damaged from the crash. Inside, curled up in the dark, the small gray dragon opened his eyes for the second time in his short life. This time, there was no crowd of dragons watching him, no mother, no commander deciding his fate. There was only silence, dust, and the distant sound of footsteps coming closer.